Elena Marchetti was 53 years old when she walked past the antique shop for the 1,000th time. She had lived in this small town in upstate New York for nearly 20 years, and every single day she took the same route to the grocery store, the post office, or the little cafe where she liked to sit alone with her coffee. Every single day, she passed that shop on Maple Street with its faded green awning and dusty windows, and every single day, she never stopped. Until one cold afternoon in November. It wasn't a special day. There was nothing remarkable about it. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that makes everything feel heavy and slow. A light drizzle had started, not enough to need an umbrella, but enough to make her coat damp and her mood a little darker. She had just finished mailing a package to her daughter who lived across the country, and she was walking home with nothing waiting for her except an empty house and the evening news. That's when she saw it. Through the foggy glass of the antique shop window, pushed into the far corner like something forgotten, sat an old, upright piano. Its wood was dark, maybe mahogany, though it was hard to tell because the finish had cracked and faded over the years. Some of the keys were visible, yellowed like old teeth. One of the legs looked slightly uneven. It was the kind of thing most people would walk right past without noticing. But Elena stopped. She stood there on the sidewalk, rain dripping down her face, staring at that piano like she had seen a ghost. And in a way, she had. You see, Elena hadn't touched a piano in over 30 years. Not since her grandmother passed away. Her grandmother, Rosa, had been the one who taught her to play. Every Sunday afternoon, little Elena would sit beside her on the worn piano bench in Rosa's tiny apartment, and together they would make music. Rosa would guide her small fingers over the keys, teaching her scales and simple songs, humming along in her warm, scratchy voice. Those Sunday afternoons were the happiest memories of Elena's childhood. When Rosa died, Elena was 22 years old. She had just graduated from college and was about to start her first real job. She remembered sitting in the hospital room, holding her grandmother's thin hand, listening to her breathing grow slower and slower until it finally stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elena had ever heard. After the funeral, the family sold Rosa's apartment and everything in it, including the piano. Elena had wanted to keep it, had begged her parents to let her take it, but she was young and had no space and no money, and practical decisions won out over sentimental ones. The piano went to a stranger, and Elena told herself she would buy another one someday. But someday never came. Life got busy. She got married, had 2 children, built a career. There was always something more urgent, more important. The years passed, and the music inside her grew quieter and quieter until she almost forgot it was ever there. Her marriage ended after 18 years. Her children grew up and moved away. And Elena found herself living alone in a house that was too big, in a town where she had never quite fit in, wondering how her life had slipped by so quickly. Now here she was, 53 years old, standing in the rain, staring at a broken old piano in a shop window, and feeling something she hadn't felt in decades. She didn't know what made her push open the door and step inside. The bell above the entrance jingled softly, and the smell of old wood and dust filled her nose. The shop was cramped and cluttered, every inch of space filled with antique furniture, vintage lamps, old books, and forgotten treasures. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, like stepping into someone else's memories. Behind the counter sat an elderly man with white hair and thick glasses. He looked up from the book he was reading and gave her a small nod. "Afternoon," he said. "Let me know if you need help finding anything." Elena nodded back but didn't speak. Her eyes were already searching for the piano. She found it in the back corner, exactly where she had seen it through the window. Up close, it looked even more neglected. There were scratches on the wood, and a thin layer of dust covered the top. The brand name above the keys had worn away until only a few letters remained. She stood in front of it for a long moment, just looking. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been. This was ridiculous, she told herself. It was just an old piano. It probably didn't even work anymore. She should turn around and leave and go home and forget about it. But her hand reached out anyway. She lifted the fallboard slowly, revealing the full keyboard underneath. The keys were stained and uneven, some of them chipped at the edges. She could see that a few of the black keys had lost their polish entirely. It was a mess. It was beautiful. Elena sat down on the bench. It creaked under her weight. She placed her fingers on the keys, and for a moment she just held them there, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips. 30 years. It had been 30 years since she had done this. She pressed down on a single key, middle C. The note rang out, slightly flat, slightly muffled, but clear enough. It echoed through the quiet shop like a voice calling out after years of silence. And then, without planning to, without even thinking about it, she began to play. The melody came from somewhere deep inside her, a place she had locked away and tried to forget. It was the lullaby her grandmother used to sing, the one Rosa had taught her on those Sunday afternoons so long ago. Elena's fingers moved across the keys, stumbling at first, hitting wrong notes, finding the rhythm slowly. But the music was there. It had always been there, waiting. The shop owner looked up from his book. His name was Harold, and he had owned this shop for over 40 years. In all that time, he had never once heard anyone play that piano. He had bought it at an estate sale back in the early 80s, thinking he could fix it up and sell it for a nice profit. But life got in the way, as it always does, and the piano just sat there year after year gathering dust. He had honestly forgotten it could even make sound anymore. But now this woman, this stranger who had walked in off the street, was playing it. And not just playing it. She was making it sing. Harold set down his book and listened. The music was imperfect, full of mistakes and hesitations, but there was something raw and honest about it, something real. It was the kind of music that made you stop what you were doing and pay attention. A customer who had been browsing near the back of the shop stopped moving. She was a young woman in her 30s, looking for a birthday gift for her mother. But now she stood frozen, a vintage jewelry box still in her hands, watching the older woman at the piano. Elena didn't notice them. She didn't notice anything. She was somewhere else entirely, back in her grandmother's apartment, back on that worn piano bench, back in a time when life was simpler and the people she loved were still alive. Tears were streaming down her face, but she didn't stop playing. She couldn't stop. It felt like something inside her that had been locked up for decades was finally breaking free. When the last note faded away, the shop was completely silent. Elena sat there with her hands still on the keys, breathing hard, trying to understand what had just happened. Then she heard the sound of someone clapping. She turned around to see Harold standing a few feet away, his old eyes wet with tears. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "I've had that piano in here for nearly 20 years. You're the first person who's ever played it." Elena wiped her face with the back of her hand. She felt embarrassed and exposed, like she had just shared something private with complete strangers. But she also felt something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt alive. Elena didn't sleep well that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying what had happened in the antique shop over and over in her mind. The feel of the keys under her fingers, the sound of that first note breaking the silence, the way the music had poured out of her like water from a dam that had finally cracked, and the look on the old shopkeeper's face when she finished playing. She told herself it was nothing, just a strange moment, a bit of nostalgia that had caught her off guard. She would go back to her normal routine tomorrow. Wake up, make coffee, watch the morning news, go about her day. The piano was just an old instrument in a dusty shop. It didn't mean anything. But when she closed her eyes, she could still hear her grandmother's voice humming that lullaby. The next morning, Elena tried to keep herself busy. She cleaned the kitchen even though it didn't need cleaning. She sorted through old mail she had been ignoring for weeks. She called her daughter and talked for almost an hour about nothing in particular. Anything to keep her mind off that piano. It didn't work. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she found herself putting on her coat and walking out the door. She told herself she was just going for a walk. She needed fresh air. Exercise was good for her, but her feet knew exactly where they were going, and 20 minutes later, she was standing outside the antique shop on Maple Street. The bell jingled when she stepped inside. Harold looked up from behind the counter and smiled when he saw her. "I had a feeling you might come back," he said. Elena felt her cheeks flush. "I don't know why I'm here," she admitted. "I just couldn't stop thinking about it." Harold nodded like he understood completely. "That piano's been waiting a long time for someone like you. Go ahead. It's not going anywhere." She walked to the back of the shop where the old upright sat in its corner. In the daylight streaming through the window, she could see it more clearly now. The scratches and chips, the worn keys, the crooked leg. It was far from perfect, but somehow that made it more beautiful, not less. Elena sat down on the bench and lifted the fallboard. She placed her fingers on the keys and took a deep breath. Yesterday had been an accident, a flood of emotion she hadn't expected. Today she wanted to really play. She wanted to see if she still remembered how. She started with scales, simple, basic scales, the kind her grandmother had drilled into her when she was just a little girl. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy at first. They didn't move the way they used to. 30 years was a long time, and her hands had forgotten so much. But slowly, note by note, the muscle memory started coming back. Her fingers began to find their places. The movements became smoother. After the scales, she tried a simple song. It was a piece she had learned for a recital when she was 12 years old, a gentle waltz that her grandmother had helped her practice for weeks. She made mistakes. Lots of them. Wrong notes, awkward pauses, moments where her fingers just refused to cooperate. But she kept going. She played the song from beginning to end, and when she finished, she played it again. Harold had stopped pretending to work. He was leaning against the counter, watching her with a soft expression on his face. He didn't say anything. He just listened. Elena lost track of time. The afternoon light shifted and faded, and still she played. She moved from one song to another, pulling melodies from the depths of her memory. Some came back easily, like old friends she hadn't seen in years. Others were harder to find, fragments and phrases that slipped away just when she thought she had them. But with each song, she felt something loosening inside her chest, something that had been wound tight for so long she had forgotten it was there. When she finally stopped, her fingers ached, and her back was sore from sitting on the old bench. She looked at the window and realized the sun was starting to set. She had been playing for almost 3 hours. "I'm sorry," she said, turning to Harold. "I didn't mean to stay so long. You probably want to close up." Harold shook his head. "Don't apologize. That's the most life this old place has seen in years." He paused, studying her face. "You're good, you know. Really good. Did you ever play professionally?" Elena laughed, but there was sadness in it. "No, I wanted to once. When I was young, I dreamed about it. Conservatory, concert halls, the whole thing. But life had other plans." "It usually does," Harold said quietly. Elena stood up and stretched her stiff legs. She looked at the piano one more time, running her hand along the dusty wood. "How much are you asking for it?" Harold scratched his chin thoughtfully. "You know, I've had that thing for almost 20 years. Never could sell it. Most people take one look at it and see junk. They want something shiny and new, Something that looks good in their living room. He smiled. But you see something different, don't you? Elena nodded. I see my grandmother. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Tell you what, come back tomorrow and play some more. No charge, no obligation. That piano's just been sitting here collecting dust. Might as well let it make some music while you figure out what you want to do. Elena wanted to argue, to say she couldn't possibly accept such kindness from a stranger. But the truth was, she didn't want to leave. She wanted to come back. She wanted to play again. Thank you, she said. I'll see you tomorrow. And she did. The next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Every afternoon, Elena walked to the antique shop and sat down at the old piano. Harold never asked her for anything. He just smiled when she came in and let her play for as long as she wanted. Word started to spread, the way it does in small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business. The mail carrier mentioned to his wife that he had heard beautiful music coming from the antique shop. The woman who ran the bakery 2 doors down told her customers about the mysterious piano player. A teenager walking home from school stopped outside the window and recorded a short video on her phone. By the end of the first week, people were coming to the shop just to listen. At first, Elena didn't notice. She was too lost in the music, too focused on rediscovering the skills she had buried for so long. But one afternoon, she finished a piece and heard something unexpected: applause. She turned around and saw a small group of people standing near the door. There were maybe 8 or 9 of them, old and young, people she had never met before. They were clapping for her, smiling at her, looking at her like she had just given them a gift. Elena didn't know what to say. Her face turned red, and she felt that familiar urge to apologize, to make herself small, to pretend she wasn't worthy of attention. But before she could speak, an elderly woman stepped forward. She was tiny, with silver hair and bright blue eyes, and she was wiping tears from her cheeks. "That song you just played," the woman said, her voice trembling. "My mother used to sing it to me when I was a little girl. I haven't heard it in 50 years. I thought I had forgotten it completely." She reached out and took Elena's hand. "Thank you. You have no idea what you just gave me." Elena felt her own eyes filling with tears. She squeezed the woman's hand and didn't trust herself to speak. That night she walked home in the dark, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel alone. Something was happening, something she didn't fully understand yet. That old broken piano in the corner of a dusty shop was changing her life. And maybe, just maybe, it was changing other people's lives too. She couldn't wait to go back tomorrow. 2 weeks passed, and Elena's life looked nothing like it had before. The woman who used to spend her evenings alone watching television now had somewhere to be every afternoon. The woman who barely knew her neighbors now had people waving at her on the street, stopping her to say hello, asking when she would play next. The woman who had felt invisible for so long was suddenly being seen. The crowds at the antique shop grew larger every day. What started as a handful of curious listeners became 10, then 20, then more than the small shop could comfortably hold. Harold had to rearrange the furniture, pushing antique dressers and old armchairs against the walls to make room for people to stand. He didn't complain. In fact, he seemed happier than Elena had ever seen him. "You know," he told her one afternoon before she started playing, "I've owned this shop for 42 years. 42 years of quiet days and slow business. I was starting to think maybe it was time to close up and retire." He looked around at the people filing through the door, chatting with each other, examining the items on the shelves. "Now look at this place. You brought it back to life." Elena shook her head. "It's not me. It's the piano." Harold smiled. "The piano's been here for 20 years and never drew a single customer. It's you, Elena. Don't sell yourself short." She didn't know how to respond to that. Compliments still made her uncomfortable. She had spent so many years feeling like she didn't matter, like she was just background noise in her own life. It was hard to accept that people actually wanted to hear her play. But they did. Every day they came back for more. The local newspaper sent a reporter to write a story about her. He was a young man, fresh out of journalism school, eager to find something interesting in their quiet little town. He interviewed Elena for nearly an hour, asking about her childhood, her grandmother, the years she spent away from music. She answered his questions honestly, even the ones that hurt. When the article came out the following week, it was on the front page, with a photograph of Elena sitting at the piano. The headline read, "The Piano That Remembered." After that, everything changed. People started coming from other towns to hear her play. They drove 20, 30, even 50 miles just to stand in a crowded antique shop and listen to a 53-year-old woman play an old, broken piano. Elena couldn't understand it. She wasn't a professional. She made mistakes all the time. The piano itself was out of tune and missing half its polish. But none of that seemed to matter. One afternoon, a man approached her after she finished playing. He was in his 60s, with a weathered face and rough hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime doing hard work. He stood there for a moment, not saying anything, just looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "My wife passed away 6 months ago," he finally said. His voice was low and steady, but Elena could hear the pain underneath. "We were married for 38 years. She was the love of my life, and I don't know how to live without her." Elena didn't say anything. She just listened. "She used to play piano," the man continued. "Not like you. She wasn't trained or anything, but she loved it. She would sit at our old upright in the living room and play for hours, just making up songs as she went. I would sit in my chair and pretend to read the newspaper, but really I was just listening to her." He paused, his jaw tightening. "After she died, I couldn't stand to hear piano music. I turned off the radio whenever it came on. I avoided restaurants that had live music. It hurt too much." He looked at Elena with tears in his eyes. "But today, listening to you play, I didn't feel pain. I felt her. It was like she was right there with me again, just for a few minutes." He reached out and shook Elena's hand. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me that." Elena held his hand tightly. She didn't have words. What could she possibly say to a man who had lost the love of his life? But somehow, the handshake was enough. He nodded at her, wiped his eyes, and walked out of the shop. Stories like that became common. Every day, someone came up to Elena with tears in their eyes, wanting to share what her music meant to them. A young mother who was struggling with loneliness after her husband's deployment overseas. A teenager who had just lost his grandfather and didn't know how to grieve. An elderly woman who was facing a frightening diagnosis and needed something beautiful to hold on to. They all found their way to that little antique shop, and they all left feeling something they hadn't felt when they walked in. Elena started to realize that the music wasn't really about her. It was about connection. It was about reminding people that they weren't alone in their pain, that beauty could still exist even in the darkest times. The piano was just a tool, a bridge between hearts that needed to find each other. She also started to realize something about herself. For 30 years, she had been running from her grief. She had buried her grandmother's memory along with the music, thinking that if she didn't touch a piano, she wouldn't have to feel the loss. But all she had done was make the loss bigger. She had cut herself off from the one thing that connected her to the person she loved most. Now, every time she played, she felt Rosa with her. Not as a painful memory, but as a presence, a warmth, a reminder that love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It just changes form. The third week brought something unexpected. A woman walked into the shop one afternoon, well-dressed and professional-looking, carrying a leather briefcase. She didn't look like the usual crowd. She stood in the back and listened to Elena play for nearly an hour without saying a word. When Elena finished, the woman approached her. "My name is Patricia Chen," she said, handing Elena a business card. "I'm a producer for the regional television station. I've been hearing about you for days, and I had to come see for myself." She smiled. "You're remarkable. I'd like to do a feature segment on you for our evening news program. Would you be interested?" Elena's first instinct was to say no. Television? That was too big, too public. She was just a woman playing piano in a little shop. She wasn't anyone special. But then she thought about the man who had lost his wife, the young mother, the grieving teenager. She thought about all the people who had found comfort in her music, and all the people who might never find their way to this small town. Maybe this wasn't about her at all. Maybe this was about something bigger. "Okay," she said slowly. "I'll do it." Patricia grinned. "Wonderful. We'll send a crew next week to film you playing. This is going to be beautiful." That night, Elena sat in her quiet house and looked at the business card in her hand. Her heart was pounding. She had no idea what she was getting herself into. But for the first time in 30 years, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. She was excited about it. The television crew arrived on a Tuesday morning. There were 3 of them, a cameraman, a sound technician, and Patricia Chen herself, who directed everything with calm efficiency. They spent an hour setting up lights and adjusting angles, turning the cramped antique shop into something that looked almost like a movie set. Elena sat on the piano bench and tried not to look as nervous as she felt. She had barely slept the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined everything that could go wrong. What if she froze up? What if her fingers forgot how to play? What if she made a fool of herself on television in front of thousands of people? Harold must have noticed her anxiety because he walked over and put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Just pretend they're not here," he said quietly. "Play like you always do. Play for the people who need to hear it." Elena nodded and took a deep breath. He was right. This wasn't about cameras or television or being famous. This was about the music. This was about connection. She closed her eyes and placed her fingers on the keys. And then she played. She started with the lullaby, the one her grandmother had taught her all those years ago. The melody filled the shop, soft and gentle, like a voice whispering secrets. Then she moved into other pieces. Songs she had rediscovered over the past few weeks, songs that carried memories and emotions she couldn't put into words. She forgot about the cameras. She forgot about the lights. She forgot about everything except the music flowing through her. When she finally stopped, the shop was silent. Patricia Chen was standing near the door with tears streaming down her face. The cameraman had stopped filming and was just staring at her. Even the sound technician, a young guy who had looked bored all morning, was wiping his eyes. "That was incredible," Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely incredible." The segment aired 3 days later on the evening news. Elena watched it alone in her living room, clutching a cup of tea that had gone cold. Seeing herself on the screen was surreal, like watching a stranger who happened to look exactly like her. But when she heard herself play, when she saw the faces of the people listening, she understood why Patricia had wanted to share this story. It was beautiful. Not because of her, but because of what the music did to people. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the broadcast, Elena's phone started ringing with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The antique shop's phone rang so constantly that Harold had to take it off the hook. People drove from towns hours away just to hear her play. The shop was so crowded that people stood outside on the sidewalk, peering through the windows, straining to hear. But that wasn't the most surprising part. 1 week after the television segment aired, Elena arrived at the shop to find Harold waiting for her at the door. He had a strange expression on his face, somewhere between confusion and wonder. "Something happened," he said. "Come look at this." He led her to the piano and pointed at the keyboard. "I was dusting this morning, and I noticed something odd. One of the keys feels different, higher than the others." Elena looked at where he was pointing. It was one of the keys near the middle of the keyboard, a white key that she had pressed thousands of times over the past month. She reached out and touched it. Harold was right. It was slightly raised, like something was pushing it up from underneath. "That's strange," she said. "It wasn't like that before." Harold nodded. "I tried pressing it down, but it keeps popping back up." "There's something under there." Elena's heart started beating faster. She didn't know why, but she had a feeling that whatever was under that key was important. "Can we open it up? Look inside?" Harold disappeared into the back room and returned with a small tool kit. Together, they carefully removed the front panel of the piano, exposing the inner workings. It was dusty and old, full of hammers and strings and wooden parts that Elena didn't know the names of. But there, wedged beneath the mechanism for the raised key, was something that didn't belong. A small wooden box. Elena reached in and pulled it out. The box was about the size of a thick book, made of dark wood with a tarnished brass latch. It was covered in dust, clearly untouched for decades. Her hands were trembling as she held it. "Open it," Harold said softly. Elena undid the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, she found a bundle of letters tied together with a faded ribbon, and underneath them, an old photograph. She picked up the photograph first. It showed a young woman, maybe in her 20s, sitting at a piano. The same piano. Elena recognized the distinctive crack in the wood, the particular curve of the music stand. The woman in the photo was beautiful, with dark hair pinned up in the style of the 1940s and a gentle smile on her face. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in elegant handwriting, were the words, "Marguerite Bellamy, 1942. Playing for those who cannot be here." Elena looked at Harold. "Who is Marguerite Bellamy?" Harold shook his head. "I have no idea. I bought this piano at an estate sale in 1983. The family was selling off everything. I never knew anything about who owned it before." Elena carefully untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The paper was yellowed and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. It was dated September 1942, and it began, "My dearest Marguerite." Over the next hour, Elena and Harold read through the letters together. There were dozens of them, all written by a man named Thomas to a woman named Marguerite. The letters told a love story, one that had unfolded during the darkest days of World War II. Thomas had been a soldier, shipped overseas to fight in Europe. Marguerite had been a music teacher in this very town, giving piano lessons to children while waiting for the man she loved to come home. The letters were beautiful and heartbreaking. Thomas wrote about the fear and chaos of war, but also about his dreams for the future. He wrote about the home they would build together, the children they would have, the life they would share. And in every letter, he asked Marguerite to keep playing the piano for him, because even though he couldn't hear it, knowing she was playing made him feel closer to her. The last letter was dated March 1945. It was shorter than the others, written in shaky handwriting. Thomas wrote that he had been wounded and was being sent to a field hospital. He told Marguerite not to worry, that he would be fine, that he would see her soon. But there were no more letters after that. Elena sat in silence, the letters spread out on her lap. She understood now. Thomas had never come home. These letters, these precious words of love and hope, were all Marguerite had left of him, and she had hidden them inside the piano, the instrument that had connected them across an ocean and a war. "We have to find out what happened to her," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to find her family." Harold nodded slowly. The estate sale was handled by a lawyer's office downtown. They might still have records. It's been over 40 years, but it's worth a try. Elena looked at the photograph of Marguerite, the young woman with the gentle smile, playing the piano for a man who would never hear her again. She felt a connection to this stranger across time, a bond forged by music and loss and love. "We'll find them," Elena said. "We have to. This story deserves an ending." Finding Marguerite's family turned out to be easier than Elena expected. The lawyer's office that had handled the estate sale was still in business, run now by the son of the original attorney. He remembered the Bellamy estate. Marguerite had passed away in 1982 at the age of 63, never married, no children. But she had a sister who had children, and one of those children, a granddaughter named Catherine, was still living just 2 towns over. Elena got Catherine's phone number from the lawyer and stared at it for a full day before she found the courage to call. What would she even say? "Hello? I found some old letters hidden in a piano that belonged to your great-aunt 60 years ago." It sounded crazy even in her own head, but she made the call anyway. Catherine answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was warm and curious, the voice of a woman in her late 50s who wasn't used to getting calls from strangers. Elena introduced herself and explained, as simply as she could, what she had found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Letters from Thomas," Catherine finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother used to talk about him. She said Marguerite never got over losing him. She waited her whole life for him to come back, even though she knew he never would." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "Did you know about the letters?" "No. No one did. We always wondered if there was more to the story, but Marguerite never talked about it. She kept everything locked inside." Catherine paused. "She gave that piano away in 1953, about 8 years after the war ended. My grandmother said Marguerite couldn't bear to play it anymore. Too many memories." They talked for almost an hour. Catherine asked about the letters, about the piano, about how Elena had come to find them. And Elena told her everything, from that first rainy afternoon when she walked into the antique shop to the moment she discovered the hidden box. By the end of the conversation, they were both crying. "I have to see them," Catherine said. "The letters, the photograph? I have to see them for myself." Elena understood. "Come to the shop," she said. "Come see the piano. I think Marguerite would want you to." They arranged to meet the following Saturday. Elena told Harold and Patricia about the discovery, and word spread quickly through the community. By the time Saturday arrived, the antique shop was packed with people who wanted to witness the reunion. Local news cameras were there. The mayor showed up. Even people who had never heard Elena play came just to be part of the moment. Catherine arrived at noon. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes, and she looked nervous as she stepped through the door. Elena met her at the entrance and took her hands. "Thank you for coming," Elena said. Catherine nodded, too emotional to speak. Her eyes found the piano in the corner, and she walked toward it slowly, like she was approaching something sacred. She reached out and touched the worn wood, tracing the crack that Elena had noticed on her very first day. "She used to play this every single day," Catherine said softly. "My grandmother told me stories. She said Marguerite played for the children she taught, but really she was playing for Thomas. She believed that somehow, wherever he was, he could hear her." Elena handed Catherine the wooden box. Inside were the letters and the photograph, exactly as she had found them. Catherine opened the first letter with trembling hands and began to read. The room was completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. They just watched as this woman met her great-aunt's lost love for the first time. When Catherine finished reading, she was sobbing. Elena put an arm around her and held her close. "He loved her so much," Catherine said through her tears, And she kept these hidden all those years. She never told anyone. She carried this alone her entire life. Elena thought about that. She thought about Marguerite, young and hopeful, waiting for a man who would never come home. She thought about all those years of silence, all those years of playing the piano with a broken heart. And she thought about herself, hiding from her own grief for 30 years, afraid to touch the keys that connected her to her grandmother. Maybe that was why she had found these letters. Maybe that was why she had walked into this shop on that rainy November afternoon. Maybe some things were meant to be discovered. "I want to do something," Elena said. "If you'll let me." She walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. The room felt even quieter, if that was possible. She looked at Catherine and said, "In one of the letters, Thomas mentions a waltz. He says it was Marguerite's favorite piece, the one she played for him before he left. Do you know what it might be?" Catherine thought for a moment. Then her eyes widened. "Yes, my grandmother mentioned it once. It was a Chopin waltz, the one in C-sharp minor." Elena knew that piece. She had learned it years ago, back when she was still taking lessons, back when her grandmother was still alive. She hadn't played it in decades, but as she placed her fingers on the keys, the memory came flooding back. She began to play. The waltz filled the room, beautiful and melancholy, full of longing and love and loss. Elena played it for Marguerite, who had waited her whole life for someone who never returned. She played it for Thomas, who had died on a battlefield far from home, dreaming of the woman he loved. She played it for Catherine, who was finally learning the truth about her family's past. And she played it for herself, for the girl she used to be, for the grandmother she still missed, for all the years she had spent running from her own heart. When the last note faded away, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Catherine stood up and walked to the piano. She placed her hand on Elena's shoulder and said, "Thank you. Thank you for finding her. Thank you for bringing her story back to life." In the weeks that followed, the story of Marguerite and Thomas spread far beyond the little town. National news programs picked it up. Newspapers across the country wrote about the piano teacher who waited for her soldier and the woman who found her letters 60 years later. People were moved by the love story, by the hidden letters, by the way music had connected two strangers across time. The town decided to restore the piano and donate it to the community center. A professional came in and fixed the broken keys, tuned the strings, refinished the wood. When the work was done, the piano looked almost new, but it still carried all its history. A small plaque was placed on the side that read, "In memory of Marguerite Bellamy and Thomas, whose love endures through music." Elena started teaching piano lessons there every Saturday morning. She taught children and adults, beginners, and people who had given up on music long ago. She taught them the same way her grandmother had taught her, with patience and warmth, and the belief that everyone has music inside them waiting to be found. Catherine came to visit often. She and Elena became close friends, bound together by a story neither of them had expected to be part of. Sometimes they would sit together at the piano, and Elena would play the waltz, and Catherine would close her eyes and imagine her great-aunt, young and beautiful, playing for the man she loved. And sometimes, when the room was quiet and the light was just right, they both swore they could feel Marguerite there with them, finally at peace. Elena never stopped playing. She played for her grandmother. She played for Marguerite and Thomas. She played for everyone who had ever lost someone and needed to be reminded that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds a new way to sing.